yesterday, Donald Trump did something that surprised a lot of people. He backed down after weeks of threatening tariffs and even floating military action over Greenland. Trump suddenly withdrew both. No tariffs, no force. Just talk of a future deal. Global markets breathed a sigh of relief. Stocks rebounded. Europe rallied, and a geopolitical crisis that looked like it might spiral suddenly didn't. But here's the key point. This wasn't a sudden change of heart. It was the most likely outcome all along. And today, I want to explain why a deal on Greenland was always the end game. What that deal probably looks like, and what this episode tells us about the real limits of Trump's power, both at home and abroad. Let's start with how markets reacted, because markets tend to be brutally honest. The moment Trump pulled back, U.S. equity futures erased most of their earlier losses. European stocks rebounded about 1.5%. In a single session, the dollar stayed weaker, and gold, which had been screaming crisis, stabilized after jumping nearly 5% this week. In simple terms, markets had been pricing in a tail risk, a low probability but high impact scenario involving tariffs, trade retaliation, or even military escalation. When that risk was taken off the table, prices snapped back. That alone tells you something important. Investors never really believed Trump could follow through on his most extreme threats. So why did Trump retreat? Not because he lost interest in Greenland, far from it, but because reality kicked in. First, domestic constraints. Trump simply doesn't have political backing at home for military escalation over Greenland. Even within the GOP, that would be a bridge too far. A conflict with NATO allies over a semi-autonomous Danish territory would fracture his own coalition. Second, European unity. Europe didn't blink. Denmark, the EU and NATO presented a remarkably cohesive front. There was no daylight to exploit, no weak link, no quiet acceptance behind closed doors. And crucially, Greenland itself made clear it has no interest in triggering independence talks just to accommodate Washington. That matters because Greenland holds the legal keys. Without Greenland voting to open negotiations with Denmark, there is no legal pathway for sovereignty change. Taken together, these constraints sharply limit Trump's options. Military action becomes implausible. Long-lasting tariffs become politically and economically costly, and coercion gives way to negotiation at that point. A deal, not domination, becomes the only viable route. What a deal would actually look like. Now, here's where things get interesting. Trump hasn't abandoned his core objectives. He's just shifting tactics. Any deal that works for the US will likely need to hit three core demands. 1. A sense of control. Trump wants to be able to say, the US secured Greenland strategically, even if sovereignty never changes. 2. Fewer constraints on US military infrastructure. That means easing environmental and permitting hurdles for base construction. 3. full freedom of weapons deployment, including offensive systems, not just defensive radar or surveillance assets. So, how do you square that circle? The most obvious solution is leasing, a long-term lease of a significant portion of Greenland, not just individual bases with broad operational control, minimal permitting friction, and long duration. But here's the catch. It would have to be extremely expensive, it would face deep skepticism in Europe, and it's not clear Trump would accept something that looks less than outright control on top of that. U.S. defense asks could expand. Icebreaker production commitments, missile defense interceptors, expanded air and naval basing, and possibly a wider NATO Arctic footprint beyond Greenland itself. In other words, Greenland could be the entry point for a much broader Arctic militarization package. The hardest part. Selling IT to Greenland, here's the part many people underestimate. Greenland isn't just a chess piece. It's a political actor. And senior officials consistently describe Greenlanders as deeply values-driven, especially when it comes to land, environment, and sovereignty. Any deal that smells like loss of control, permanent foreign military expansion, or erosion of self-determination will be incredibly hard to sell locally. That's why NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte's involvement, while symbolically useful, doesn't solve the problem. He has no mandate to negotiate on Greenland's behalf. Ultimately, the deal only works if Denmark's red lines are respected: territorial integrity and the right of Greenlanders to decide their own future. Without that, negotiations stall, regardless of what Washington wants. What this episode really reveals about Trump. Zooming out, the Greenland episode tells us something bigger. It exposes the gap between Trump's rhetoric and his real operating space. Yes, he uses threats aggressively. Yes, he pushes boundaries. But when confronted with unified allies, legal constraints, weak domestic backing, and market backlash, he still recalibrates, and that matters going forward. As Trump shifts focus back to domestic politics and midterm campaigning at a time when his polling remains under pressure, his ability to sustain prolonged international confrontations will be tested again and again. Greenland wasn't the start of a new era of unchecked coercion. It was a reminder that even Trump ultimately has limits. So the crisis fades, markets move on, and negotiations begin. But don't mistake this for the end of the story. Greenland is still strategic. The Arctic is still militarizing, and Trump is still Trump. The difference now is that everyone understands where the real boundaries lie.